All right, folks, because you demanded it, today's the day. We're finally going to weigh in on the YouTube channel, Whatifalthist. Whatifalthist is the channel of a guy named Rudyard Lynch. It started out with alternative history speculation, but now seems to mostly be about history and geopolitics. The channel is quite successful, doing a much better job than I do at drawing an audience to similar subject matter. The first thing to say about Whatifalthist is that I enjoy many of his videos. I'm in awe of the range of topics that he covers and the length at which he covers those topics. In recent months, he has attempted to sum up a wide range of world civilizations and thrown in genetics, Germany, and Taiwan for good measure. As I will get into, this breadth of coverage sometimes leads to some very shallow analysis, but wow, do I admire the ambition and work ethic. If you watch more than a handful of his videos, though, the whole approach begins to grate a bit. My understanding is that this guy is still in his very early 20s, but he's adopted this persona of a curmudgeonly old right-winger who knows it all. It's honestly a little ridiculous. And I feel comfortable calling it ridiculous because when I was in my early 20s, 2 decades ago, I did the exact same thing. I was an angry young man who didn't like the world I saw and gravitated towards a ready-made right-wing critique. I'm lucky that there wasn't a YouTube when I was in my early 20s and the war on terror was starting. All I could do was send long emails to my friends and family, filled with nonsense about how defending Western civilization required killing a bunch of Iraqis. Obviously, no literate person in 2022 can defend US foreign policy anymore. But the more I watch Whatifalthist videos, I see my old ideology that was somehow both cynically libertarian but also Western chauvinist peeking out behind his work. Whatifalthist's videos used to come with this disclaimer, which I find very charming. Any of us who choose to do this kind of work are on an ego trip, but I think the regurgitating part is still very true of his channel. And I think Whatifalthist is poorly served by his reading list. This gets more obvious the less well covered the topic is. Last week, he uploaded a China video that I think is pretty spot on. The Peter Zeihan-style demographics millenarianism gets a little old, but that's a common malady. All of us geopolitics nerds have to think about China a lot, and Whatifalthist is a pretty smart guy, so he sees through a lot of the defense industry nonsense. But when he covers something that isn't widely discussed, the situation gets pretty bad. Like the European scramble for Africa in the late 19th century, for example. Whatifalthist starts his analysis of the scramble by beating up on a straw man that I don't think any serious academic has argued for since the 1920s. Anybody who has studied the scramble seriously knows there wasn't any economic rationale for what the European empires did to Africa. It was just bloody, evil conquest for the sake of bragging rights at international conferences. Whatifalthist seems to think that pointing this out makes the scramble more virtuous somehow?
Almost none of the African colonies turned a profit. For the ones that did, like South Africa, the money wasn't extracted back to Europe but was spent in the colony. The big exception to this that people like to treat like it's the rule is Leopold's Congo, in which the Belgian evil tyrant brutally exploited the Congo to extract rubber back to Belgium for 20 years, in the process killing 8 million people. However, out of the 54 African countries over a 70-year period, this is the only real case of something like this happening.
So when I first heard that, I was enraged. But then, upon review, I took a step back. I was like, let's be fair to the kid. He couldn't possibly be saying that the Congo was the only place where Europeans did bad things. He's making the much smaller, also dubious point that the Congo was the only place that was truly profitable for Europe. Right?
Similarly, European economic conduct in Africa can't be described as fully exploitive. The African colonies before the Great Depression in real terms had free trade in which they could trade with whoever they wanted independently of their home countries. The Europeans subsidized the industries there, and Africans, although paid far less than Europeans, were still paid far more than what they'd get in a fundamentally subsistence economy.
Now that is some bullshit. Let me give you some stuff to Google. How about the Herero Genocide? According to the US Holocaust Museum, that's a people numbering 80,000 that the Germans wiped out almost entirely. Let's think for a second about the nature of war during the scramble for Africa. The biggest example would probably be the Battle of Omdurman, where a fully industrialized British army wiped out 12,000 Sudanese fighters in a single day, with a loss of under 50 soldiers on the British side. Maybe the sorts of books that Whatifalthist reads see this as some kind of great victory. But it wasn't a battle to defend British honor, it was a battle to crush Sudanese freedom in Sudan. The Battle of Omdurman was a massive one-day horror show, but this imbalance was part of everyday life throughout Africa for 70 years. Any attempt to rebel, or even in many cases, participate in basic economic life with a status above the level of de facto slave labor, was crushed mercilessly. The idea that the indigenous were somehow encouraged to participate or benefit from free trade is insanely ignorant. Africa is a huge continent, and Whatifalthist is right that there was no real economic rationale for European presence in most of it. There were large swaths of interior Africa, ironically including much of the Sudan, where Europeans were barely present. In those places, you could maybe make a case for indigenous freedom and just maybe some economic opportunities. The story is different in important ways north and south of the Sahara. But in sub-Saharan Africa, if there was something the white man wanted, be it gold, land, or forced labor, the white man took it, mercilessly. In Kenya, the fertile White Highlands were designated for their exclusive use. In 1931, half of the entire land area of southern Rhodesia, today's Zimbabwe, was stipulated for the use of white farmers, who at the time numbered no more than 2,500. In South Africa, some 87% of the total area was declared white land. This is from Martin Meredith's Fate of Africa. How the hell were Africans supposed to benefit from free trade when they weren't even allowed to own land in most of the territories that were incorporated in the world trading system?
A perfect example of how Africa was colonized for strategic and not economic reasons was that after World War II, when the competition between European countries was stopped by all becoming American allies against the Soviets, decolonization in Africa took within a 10-year period without much real resistance on Europe's part.
Jesus fucking Christ. Google the Suez Crisis or the horrific independence wars in Algeria, Kenya, Mozambique, Angola, and many other places. I mean, come on, if you're going to write about geopolitics, you should probably know a little 20th century history. Most of Africa was colonized by France and Britain. After their humiliations in the Second World War, both countries were very committed to holding on to their empires by any means necessary. It was only the blood spilled by hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Kenyans, Algerians, and other freedom fighters across the continent that forced the Europeans out. France and Britain did leave some places relatively quickly, but those were the places that had no economic value to them anyway. Europeans had to be bloodily forced out of everything in Africa that they found at all useful. The Portuguese held on until the 1970s, when they were finally kicked out by violent independence movements as well. Whatifalthist's deeply ignorant coverage of Africa shows the weakness of his sources. Whatever crap inspired this video had to mention the horror of the Belgian Congo thanks to a great book that forced it into the popular consciousness within the past decade or so. But the inconvenience of the now well-known Congo crimes gets explained away and pushed back into a sea of European imperial propaganda that hasn't changed much since the 19th century. I can't get too angry at Whatifalthist over this ignorant nonsense because it's exactly the sort of thing that I used to believe when I relied on mostly right-wing and libertarian sources on Africa. Whatifalthist's coverage of white countries is often literate and sometimes very perceptive. And I think he's committed to getting there on other countries as well. Consider the way that this still from the Africa video illustrates his learning process. I think after he started making the video and started thinking a little harder about the nonsense he was regurgitating, he started seeing the seams. This passage, which concedes that the Europeans held most Africans in de facto slavery well into the 20th century, makes the rest of his argument nonsense. He quickly moves on, but I take this text block as a sign that he has a conscience, and he is growing a bit. Whatifalthist's volume of production is a problem. These aren't just half-hour-long videos, these are super freaking dense half-hour-long videos, filled with maps and big blocks of text you have to pause to read. Each individual video is an onslaught. Claim follows claim at lightning speed. Some claims are clever observation, but there's also a lot of politically motivated silliness. Some historical analysis is very clever, but there's a lot of long exploded nonsense, like most of the Africa video I just reviewed. I had intended to do a broader critique of Whatifalthist's work, but looking into like a third of the claims made in one of his shortest videos has already gotten me a longer script than I want to produce on this topic. But I did watch a lot of his videos, so let's do a sort of speed round. This video forecasting imminent economic collapse tells the kind of story I have told before on this channel, just more carefully. I agree that inflation and budgets will eventually matter. After the 2008 financial crisis, I was writing blog posts calling Paul Krugman crazy for wanting more deficit spending. And then I watched Donald Trump blow up the US federal budget with no consequences. Back in 2010, I believed everything that this video has to say about imminent economic collapse. But it's 12 years later now. Nothing I believed in came true. The hyperinflation fundamentalists have been proved wrong over and over again. If you believe that we are in a Weimar-type situation because we've had like 2 months in a row of 6% inflation, you are either very, very young or very, very stupid. The MFF's chat moderator is from Malaysia, and he drew my attention to the insanity of this video suggesting that Singapore should have taken over Malaysia. For one thing, this does not stand for Hong Kong Singapore Banking Corporation. It's Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation. For another, the crazy counterfactual proposed in the video actually happened. Singapore's dictator Lee Kuan Yew tried to run Malaysia and rightly decided it was impossible for an affluent city-state to successfully control a country with 8 times the population and like infinitely more landmass. Whatifalthist loves theories about culture and the potential of imperialism, but doesn't seem to have much of a grasp of numbers or geography. When I was a young man, I had fantasies like this too, until the Iraqis and the Afghans proved me wrong. Before I watched that Scramble for Africa atrocity, I was going to focus on critiquing this Wars of the 2020s and 2030s video. Despite Whatifalthist's considerable critical thinking skills, this video is a fairly dumb regurgitation of the paranoid fantasies churned out by warmongering outfits like Harvard University and the New York Times. It's mostly warmed over Halford McKinder and Thucydides trap nonsense. If you're interested, I have videos demolishing both of those mythologies. I think the Whatifalthist YouTube channel is best described as juvenilia. Rudyard Lynch is obviously a smart kid, and he's clearly much better at building an audience than I am. I think he's going to do great things, but he hasn't yet. Discarding the silly ideology of my adolescence helped me see the world much more clearly. I look forward to seeing what Lynch will produce when he does the same. Thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, and let me know what you think in the comments. Thanks.